Well, yesterday was the Feast of the Holy Innocents. This is the event that we have narrated in Matthew chapter 2. And that ties in with one of our family traditions, which is watching the nativity story. But I've noticed that not a lot of people seem to know this 2006 Catherine Hardwicke directed movie. See, the story began and ended with this ruthless and paranoid decision of Herod the Great. We know that Herod had already killed his favorite wife and 2 or 3 of his sons. The story says 2, but there's another son that later dies. He further threatens one of his sons, then in the story, Herod Antipas. Herod's decision to kill all the boys 2 and under who lived in and around Bethlehem highlights the precarious world that Jesus was born into. Now, past representations of the numbers killed were in the tens of thousands. That's what they had thought. But really, that has been adjusted down considerably as they do more research. Professor Albright estimates that the population is around 300. That's the whole population of Bethlehem at the time. So the boys who were 2 years old and younger could have been anywhere between 6 and 20 children. But that doesn't matter, does it? How many children were killed doesn't matter, because the murder of even one child is a horrible atrocity. And Jesus could have been a part of that number if Joseph had not been warned to flee beforehand. So the beauty of watching this same movie year after year is that new parts of the story hit you and cause you to notice. And this year I was moved to weep with Rachel, who refused to be comforted because her children were no more. But even as my stomach knotted up just thinking about the suffering of the world and then the Christian response to suffering and injustice, I was reminded of our gospel passage today, John 1:5. You can find that on page 886. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. This is the verse that we will be reflecting on today. So my first point, we Christians cannot put our heads in the sand and pretend that there is no darkness anymore. There was deep darkness for the families of Herod's murderous rage, his paranoia. And our traditional response to these kinds of tragedies don't quite hit the mark. Really not even close. 1, that suffering, hardship strengthens your character and enables you to grow. Or its corollary, God teaches us endurance and then therefore purifies us through our suffering. No, we cannot pretend that there is no darkness. We can't jump ahead and somehow explain away to those who are still in the midst of their grief that God is bringing about some good for their suffering. Perhaps it is too soon, even if it will eventually be true. Perhaps not. See, we get uncomfortable with other people's grief, and we must think of something to say that will bring them comfort. Of course, maybe we're looking for comfort for ourselves as well. But what if we really understood what God is trying to say by this verse? The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. See, we have finished our time of Advent, in which hope is one of the major themes. But it is not tolerable to speak of hope unless we are willing to look squarely at the overwhelming presence of evil in our world. Malevolent, disproportionate evil could be, but isn't, could be a profound threat to Christian faith. Truth is, it's easy to think that darkness has overcome the light. My mind goes to the notorious Navy SEAL who has been in the news lately, Edward Gallagher, who one day from his sniper nest shot a girl in a flower print hijab who was walking with other girls on the riverbank. Her friends, fearing for their own lives, dragged her away. How can we Christians say that this is not an illustration of the deepest darkness there is? We Christians cannot pretend that there is no darkness anymore. And that's my first point. And my second point is actually John's point, that the darkness has not overcome the light. We acknowledge the darkness, but how are we to believe that the darkness is not somehow stronger or more powerful? How is the light brighter than the darkness that we know all too well? Well, to answer that one, we need to go back to the beginning, as in all the way to the very beginning. In the beginning, the Word, that is Jesus, already was. Well, I should say is. Anyway, so we actually start before the beginning, outside of time and space in eternity. Time doesn't exist, space doesn't exist, but God exists in eternity, and the Word exists. I have existed, it's a mess. God is still one. God is still one, but the Word is distinct from God. So two of the most fundamental affirmations about Jesus in the gospel are that he himself is the presence of God's own life and light, and that his life and light are available to human beings. See, the Son reveals the Father, who is for all the world to see. See, John affirms in verse 4, in Jesus was life, and the life was the light of men or people. Jesus' first creative act at creation was calling forth light. Later, God placed lights in the sky to separate light from darkness. And we know that light is necessary for life to even exist. Now, John is saying that this light that we know of, well, that was in Jesus. In other words, Jesus is the source of life, both physical and spiritual. Jesus is the source of supernatural life, as only the light of Jesus makes it possible for us to have the capacity to make moral decisions. But then there's also the tragic part, and that's the conflict. Darkness is in rebellion against the light. Darkness exists as the world estranged from God, the spiritually blind, the fallen, the sinful, the world that is dominated by Satan. But that darkness, Satan's darkness, has not overcome the light. And I haven't forgotten our question. How are we to believe that the darkness is not somehow stronger or more powerful? How is the light brighter than the darkness that we know all too well? Well, the answer, of course, is Jesus. Galatians 4:4, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. So how is the light brighter? God shows up. God doesn't depend on philosophy or intellectual enlightenment. God doesn't require an entrance fee for our good behavior. Even though God is eternal and the supreme light, God shows up in flesh, fully human, able to walk and talk eventually and live like one of us. verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So although Jesus avoids murder as a baby by King Herod, he does not escape death by the state altogether. See, it is Pontius Pilate, an official of the Roman Empire, who put Jesus to death. And it looked like darkness had vanquished the light. As I prepared this sermon, having already decided the theme, I noticed that a fellow Anglican priest, Esau Macaulay, had an opinion piece published in the New York Times on the very topic of the Holy Innocents. And he says this, quote, "But Christians believe that none of this suffering was in vain. The cries of the oppressed do not go forever unanswered. We believe that the children slaughtered by Herod were ushered into the presence of God and will be with him forever. The Christian tradition also affirms that Jesus' suffering served a purpose, that when the state ordered his death, God was at work. Through the slaughter of the truly innocent one, God was emptying death of its power, vanquishing evil, and opening the path toward forgiveness and reconciliation. So it might look like murderous tyrants like Herod are winning. It might look like the darkness of Satan's dominion is overcoming the goodness of God's light, even as Jesus hung on a tree. It might look like the light is being snuffed out in a friend's life, or in viewing conflict on a global scale. But the Apostle John and I are here to say that the light that existed before time or space existed has already won, is winning, will win, and will completely vanquish, obliterate, destroy the darkness. The light shines in the darkness, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Our job is to trust the light, to walk in it, and not just at Christmas, but our whole lives. Amen.